Okay, so recording is started. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So two remaining issues. One I added yesterday because I'm an evil person. That one is around the credentials that we have in the CSI spec. In particular, the way that it's currently defined, we have a ton of different credentials, basically one for every single RPC. And the challenge with this is that the way that it's currently worded, it expects COs to basically expose that to end users in their API. And I wanted to get clarification on this. Either we should word it to require that, or we should try to whittle down the required credentials into something that's a little bit more manageable. I've had some back and forth with a few people on this thread, and it looks like we came down to a couple of proposals. One proposal is to basically have one set of secrets for both, for each pair of operations. So for example, a provisioner credential for create and delete, controller publish for both publish and unpublish, and then for node publish, for the node operations, only have credentials on the publish side, not on the unstaged side, because we can't really think of a good reason to have a credential on the unstage and unpublished side for node. The alternative proposal is to leave the operations as they currently are, but loosen the wording to allow the CO to expose it as they choose. So for example, the CO could choose to expose all 8 secrets as just one string to string map. The drawback of this is that if there is basically the plugin can't expect the same key having 2 different values from 2 different RPCs, because ultimately the CO could just expose one key value map to the end user, and that would cause collisions. And the point 2 and 3 of this proposal are identical to the other proposal, which is rename credentials to secrets and then remove credentials from node publish and node unstage. I wanted to gauge what the preference is in this room, proposal 4 or proposal 3. Is the problem understood, or can I clarify anything?
Yeah, I think I chat with you on this. I think the spec itself should not dictate how CO should map the secret, and it's up to the CO to decide how to do those mapping. Like some CO might decide, hey, for create and delete, I use the same secret. I only allow user to specify one secret for both create and delete. Maybe some CO decide like, hey, you want to allow user to specify different credentials for different operations, create and delete. For example, create is like using user account, and delete is like sysadmin account, things like this. So I think we don't have to dictate that in the spec. And also, I think that the plugins implementation should be pretty similar, like just react to those passed in credentials. I don't think like it needs to be aware of those mappings. So
yeah, I mean, the only drawback there is that basically the key collision potential, it shouldn't really be an issue. I mean, I don't see why someone would want to accept a particular key like username and expect 2 different values from 2 different calls. And if that's something that we're laying down the line, then I think I'm okay with that. Anybody else?
I think that sounds okay. I think that sounds like a more restrictive. I think it's better to be more restrictive initially, until we find a use case. That sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. So it sounds like 201 is the one that you prefer, G, and I think Sergey mentioned offline. I think Sergey, you prefer 201 as well.
Yeah, that's correct. The proposal 4.
Okay. Any other preferences in this room? Or?
Just a question. Does it make sense for a plugin to declare its requirement for credentials up front in the get capabilities call? Is that, I mean, I don't want to like add more confusion or complication, but I'm just wondering if it seems to me that if it's a kind of plugin that needs secrets for all this stuff, or if it knows that it needs credentials, it could be helpful to have it declare that up front, which would allow the CO to kind
we need
of.
that as a requirement, because the way that this is currently worded, the way that it's exposed to people who are going to be using this plugin is that it's exposed in documentation. So it's up to the end user to say, okay, I'm using this particular type of volume plugin, therefore I must specify this particular credential in this form. And then
Yeah, a lot of times people don't read documentation though, especially
right.
when,
And in
when
that
it
case,
touches end users. So it would just give us a way of early outing, right, from the CO to say like, I know I need credentials. You haven't given me any credentials.
yeah.
I can fill before I try and spin up your work.
Yeah. That's a good idea. I think
maybe
one of the drawbacks of that would be like, you know, we have 8 different operations that accept credentials right now. Would we have 8 separate capabilities or something like that?
Yeah.
Regardless, I think it's something we can add in the future. That would be an additive change.
Yep.
Adding
Fair
is
enough.
always easier than removing. Right now, I'm just concerned about if we are going to remove calls or if we're going to reword them. I want to make sure we get those in.
Yep.
Okay, so it sounds like there's not too much debate on this. I'll follow up with G offline. It sounds like 201 is the one that we're going to go with. If you have opinions on it, please take a look at it, comment on the issue. Otherwise, we'll switch over to the big issue, which is around versioning. All right, so 0.2. All right, who wants to lead this discussion? Is James on the line by any chance?
Looks like he is.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, so I put together this PR, you know, because we were talking about how to kind of protect ourselves against, you know, breaking, you know, incompatible changes in the spec. And one of the suggestions was, yeah, for, you know, major version releases, you know, maybe there's a way that we could namespace the RPCs so that it's, you know, we have a little better protection for clients that might want to use both or something, right? You know, both versions. So that's essentially what I tried to do with this PR, right? Is, you know, version the Proto namespace. You know, Julian made a suggestion, or a comment rather, that, you know, the gRPC wire protocol can be sensitive to protobuf package names. So I split out the get supported versions RPC into a separate service called versioned, and the intent is that service doesn't change across CSI releases. You know, it's protobuf package is CSI. It will always be CSI. It will never be CSI.v1 or v2, right? So versioned, and that's really important, right? Because that's how a CO and a plugin negotiate the version of the protocol that they're going to use. And so, you know, once it's decided, like what the CO is going to use for a version, then it can speak CSI.v1 or CSI.v2, right? And that's where you get into, you know, all the other gRPC services that we defined. And so, you know, some mechanical consequences of this is that there's a couple different protobuf files now. You know, there's one protobuf file that just captures the version service and the messages related to it. And then there's another protobuf file that is basically everything else in a different protobuf package namespace. And then I also tweaked the Go build process so that you know, the protos are compiled down into a V1 package. You know, I kind of expressed an opinion about what the Go package name should be. I feel somewhat flexible there. But I tend not to like packages that are just called V1, V2, but it's not a deal breaker for me if we want to rename that. So anyway, that was, I feel like I'm just rambling. That's kind of the highlights. And there was some other feedback on the issue related to this. That, well, should we do this just for major versions, or should we also do it for minor versions before V1, or at least minor versions that break? You know, I don't know. I don't know what you guys want to do. So,
Yeah.
I guess my inclination would be just to leave everything kind of loosey-goosey until we strike V1 on that front. I mean, I feel like it's nice to have the versioning support in place, but
yeah, I would tend to agree, although it could be tricky. Like if one CO supports 0.2 and another one supports 0.4, basically a plugin is not going to work on both. You have to package them differently.
yeah, and that's true. I mean, it just kind of means that we should think about getting to V1 quicker, but I think that that's a general goal, right? Having stable, non-breaking API sooner rather than later will definitely help if we can manage it. So I guess the other bit of feedback that I put at the end of this is that although I was kind of promoting the idea of separating out get supported versions, I guess mainly I just wanted for version negotiation to be coherent, and I felt like it wasn't before, and now it is. So like if this is what everybody thinks is good, then I'm cool with it. But I'm kind of questioning whether or not this is too much version negotiation and too much plumbing, and whether or not, you know, we're adding this RPC, which theoretically will allow the CO to reason about which client version it should use or something like that. But I think in practice, particularly in the near term, most of us are only going to have one client version that we support. And then later on, we're maybe going to have one client per major version. But I'm not sure that this RPC actually gives us any insight that we wouldn't get if we just took it out and had the CO just try calling the V1 probe with whatever version it supports and try calling the V2 probe.
So something else that might be interesting is on the Kubernetes side, we're trying to come up with a standard way to be able to discover and understand the versions of an arbitrary plugin that's exposed as a gRPC socket, Unix domain socket. So, you know, CSI is going to be one set of these volume plugins that are going to exist on these systems, but we're going to have potentially others like device plugin, GPUs, potentially even CNI or other types of volume plugin or other types of plugins that are going to be available. And so the idea would be that that Kubernetes, the kubelet should be able to scan a particular directory recursively, maybe put an inotify on there. And if a new socket is discovered, it should have some mechanism by which it can discover what the type of that particular plugin is, like CSI, what the name of that plugin is, and what the versions are. Now, we could do this completely independent of CSI. We could have sidecar containers that will do this version negotiation. But it sounds like we're heading towards, on the CSI side, something for adding in version negotiation. And since neither of these proposals is baked yet, it might be worth it to try to align them so that we come up with something that can be used more broadly than just CSI. and be adopted by more COs than just Kubernetes.
So that sounds cool. I guess that would be it would be awesome if that was already baked. I'm wondering again. That to me, I guess I would just go back to that. Sounds like it reinforces my argument that we ought to just get rid of get supported versions, because then we could add that and it would be mostly just additive.
That's true.
We wouldn't be having redundancy. So I guess if nobody's actually needing get supported versions in the near term, then it would be great if we didn't have to add a fourth service or the second protobuf file just to have it.
So Julian, just to be clear, so you suggest remove that get supported version and also the version that we pass into each RPC calls. Is that correct?
No. We leave the version we're passing into the RPC calls because that's important, right? That's how the plugin says you're speaking an incompatible version. We just get rid of the get supported versions call.
I see.
Right. And so in the beginning, when you give the CO an address, it's going to try and spin up its V1 client, right? And it's going to try and call probe or get plugin capabilities or something. It's going to pass a version. The plugin then say, no, I want to talk that version, right?
Okay.
And that should be all we need, I think. So we can just simplify this. Then strictly get some version out of this bar.
Julian, you're breaking up a little bit. Maybe turn off your video.
Okay, so I think my question is, given that we are doing this versioning, like we're gonna have CSI v1, CSI v2, like the plugin should be able to tell which RPC the incoming request is on, and tell like what's the version that CO assumed. Do we still need that version in the each RPC call, or am I understanding incorrectly? This is something not, like, or I'm missing something.
Well, I think in the near term, we definitely do, because we have kind of incompatibilities, right? 0.1 and 0.2 are totally incompatible. So if I'm making a 0.2 plugin, somebody comes.
I'm losing you, Julian.
Yeah, Julian, I think you're breaking up pretty bad.
So can we work this from, while Julian gets his connection back, from a end-to-end perspective, the use cases that we want to enable are, we want a volume plugin to be able to expose multiple versions on a single socket. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's one of the goal.
Okay. So if we want a single plugin to be able to expose multiple versions on a single socket, then it needs to be able to reference multiple versions of the spec. And the proposal that James has out right now will allow that to happen by basically having a versioned API that is a version generated bindings exposed that you could import as a whole and select which version you want to use. So you could have different parts of your system reference. Actually, could you, question for James, if I wanted to import two different versions of the Go bindings, since the package name is both CSI, how would that work?
So from a protobuf perspective, they're not, right? The proto package is CSI.v1 or CSI v2. In Golang, you could alias the import. So you could just alias, call it CSI v1 or something, right?
Okay. Okay, and so then you could basically import both versions into your plugin, and then your plugin can expose a socket that will be able to handle either. So that part is fine. The next part is for the CO to be able to understand that there are multiple versions exposed and to be able to select one that it prefers. So the suggestion that has been proposed is to have a non-version new service that is solely for versioning, that we move the get versions to, or the alternative, which Julian is proposing, is you basically have the caller issue a version probe call for all the versions that it wants in the order that it wants, and the first one that succeeds is the one that should work. I'm okay with that as a starting point, and then because it sounds like in order to come up with something versioned, we should probably think it through a little bit more.
I'd be okay with that. I think their other use case though is, I'll use topology as an example just because it's an additive thing on an existing RPC. But let's say we have 1.0 and there's no topology, and 1.1 there is topology. The CO will need to know, you're telling me you want topology requirements, but this plugin doesn't actually support it yet. So you're gonna have to figure out that versioning there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Where like I think like V1, V2 is like API level backwards compatibility. Like, and I think like the version inside get supported version is also for like additional information, exactly for like additive changes like topology or something else.
Shouldn't those be handled with capability though? To me, it's much clearer if I want to say, hey, this plugin requires topology, to put that as a capability.
I mean, that's one example. I prefer if capabilities didn't like turn into like 100 different capabilities over time. But certainly topology would likely fall into capability. But I'm sure there's other things we'll come up with.
Yeah, I just feel like if we're actually making backward compatible additions, most of those, it's a shame if we have to reason about those things based on the version. You're going to end up with some gruesome switch statement or something, you know? So I'd rather see something more explicit for that kind of thing. Like if I've got my version of the client and I'm not sure whether or not this plugin has some stuff in it, I would much rather have an explicit kind of declarative way of saying, yeah, this plugin requires credentials, or this plugin requires topology, or something like that. So again, you know, I don't.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. That rather be more explicit on the capability of the plugin and the CO. So using capability is better than using just version numbers. Yeah, I agree with that.
So one point I'd like to make is that, you know, from my understanding, one of the goals here was to provide the version negotiation because we're concerned about breaking API changes, not something like an additive change that's non-breaking. So one example would be the proto fields are renumbered, right? So you could issue probe all day long, but if the proto fields have been renumbered and there's data that you can't even get a serialized probe request over the wire so the client can understand it.
So I think the gRPC way of official recommended way of maintaining backwards compatibility is you never remove a number after you add it. You can rename it, but you can never remove it. And if you want it to be deprecated, just rename it to deprecated _ and create something new. And that's how you maintain backwards compatibility. We could, you know, get around all of that by having our own versioning on top of it, but I think it might be worth just sticking with a gRPC recommendation.
Right. that recommendation is fine for changes that are non-breaking.
Yeah.
I guess, like I said, my understanding was that we were thinking, oh, well, in V2. So let's, right now where we are with this upcoming, V0.2 cut, we've already renumbered fields, right?
Yeah.
Now, once we lock on to V1, and hopefully before then, we're going to stop doing that, right? And so we're going to make, backwards compatible changes, right? The goal of this was, as far as I understood, was to allow us to, take new directions, try new things with V2 without worrying about breaking compatibility. Like we could renumber fields, we could delete fields completely, right? Like it wouldn't matter, it's V2, it's in a different namespace. This is more of like and maybe that's why there's a little bit of pushback on this, because it seems like a little bit of future proofing. But
there's another use case with this too for the vendor, right? Like if I want to ship my storage driver, I don't want in it, and I want to be able to support multiple COs, may want to include all the version calls.
Right. Yeah. If you wanted to ship like a universal driver, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, for that to work across CSI spec versions that have completely breaking changes, you need a stable API to discover the version, right? Otherwise, your chances for success are going to vary. So
the part about I think just having version proto packages, I think more or less we're all in agreement on that. There might be some disagreement about exactly what the semantics of that looks like. The current proposal is that we're going to generate language bindings that are versioned, and we're going to maintain all of them in head. The details of that needs to be flushed out. I think we can sort that out offline. The next big question, like you said, is version discovery. And I think that's the aspect of this that is potentially, we should think through it more rather than add it in last minute, because we're going to be adding it in as a service that is going to be unversioned and can no longer change in the future. Before we add that, we should really think it through. And I think we can take a step in this direction without specifying the discovery portion of it in this release. We could add in the discovery portion of it in a future release and just take these steps to have version Go bindings or versioned language bindings in this release.
So are you suggesting, Saad, to follow the path of removing get supported versions from the identity API as it currently exists?
Yes, basically remove, either remove get supported versions or leave it as is and then remove it in a subsequent version and replace it with something that's version agnostic. But basically introducing something that is version agnostic in a future release.
Yeah, I would favor removing it just because removing it is a breaking change, and we're trying to get all the breaking changes in.
Yeah.
While we're already smashing apart the kitchen.
Yeah. So we go ahead and we remove get versions from this release. And then for the next release, we reassess and figure out what a proper version negotiation service should look like. And then we can add that in as an additive change.
Sounds good.
Okay. Any disagreement on that? Okay.
I think I want to think about that a little more.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think, and I don't know that I have a ton to add right now. I hadn't considered that as a possibility. So
okay.
I want to make sure we're not missing something really important by getting rid of that.
Yeah.
I mean, we can keep it version and break it And you can always call V1 get supported versions, and then later drop the version if we come up with something that's permanent. It's
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that I think Julian made a point was that if we're going to put things into a like a versioned protobuf namespace, well, then it doesn't even make sense to have get supported versions because you've already versioned the protobuf namespace, right? So,
well, if you call V1 get supported versions, it could still return V3.
Yeah, but it's not really meaningful, right? Because it's already in a versioned namespace, and the whole point of get supported versions is to allow version negotiation across, across CSI spec versions that may be incompatible, right? And so if we're not going to make incompatible changes,
Yeah, that's a good point.
then why even have it in the version space, right? So, but like I said, I want to think about it a little more before I say, yeah, let's just get rid of it. So
if in the future, if we come up with our calls that we don't feel will break, are we going to move them out of the version namespace?
I think the intent is that we limit things that are in the unversioned namespace. At least that was my intent, and kind of in this experiment, right? Which was, clearly isolate the unversioned API into a separate service, into a separate protobuf namespace, right? And then the goal would be to minimize things that are in that file, because if it's unversioned, that means it's really, really hard to change, right? So if we're going to support an unversioned namespace, then we have to really minimize what goes in there, and then everything else would go into a version.
Yeah, and that's actually what gRPC recommends, is that it should be completely, the service itself should be unversioned, the proto should be unversioned, and then the changes would be additive. If anything needs to be deprecated, you just rename it to deprecated and add in something new.
Right. Right, and that's useful for non-breaking type changes, right? So that's very useful.
Once we get to 1.0, I think that becomes viable, but before 1.0, where we are making breaking changes, that's more challenging to do. Because that is another option that we could take, which is leave everything as is. It is unversioned and it remains unversioned. We will try our best between 0.2 and 0.3 to not make any backwards compatibility breaking changes. And if we need to, we will. And then post 1.0, then we absolutely cannot, and we must follow the gRPC recommendation for backwards compatibility, which is that all fields are additive. If you need to deprecate an existing field, you rename it, but you never reuse its number or type.
So Sal, I think the issue is when you're switching from pre 1.0 and post 1.0, do you add this package name or CSI v1, or you don't? If you plan to do that, then it's not going to be compatible between pre 1.0 and the post 1.0. So that's the reason I think it will be nice to get this change into 0.2 and never make I think then and we can keep. I don't know how do we make sure that it's backwards compatible with 0.2 and 0.3. But at the very least, we know we're gonna do that change after 1.0, and we're not trying to do that breaking change at the last minute.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider is that we've focused a lot on wire protocol in these discussions, right? With with field number and not changing that, and you can rename fields, but you don't remove them or something, right? Making additive only changes. Well, there's actually changes that you can make to the spec that don't actually require changes to the protobuf, but change the semantics of calls, right? Oh, this call should be executed after this other call, not before it, or this call can be executed many times, not just once, or this can only be executed once, right? So those kind of nuances aren't captured in protobuf, but could be captured if you had a protocol version negotiation mechanism.
Yeah. So I agree, but those kinds of changes should not happen post 1.0. Between 1.0 and 2.0, they may, but at that point, you know, we could just introduce a new V2 package, CSI V2. It could be a completely independent repository even. I guess what I'm starting to lean towards now is maybe adding in all this additional versioning pre 1.0 is overkill. Post 1.0, all the changes should be additive. There shouldn't be any behavioral changes. And then once we cut a V2.0, it'll be just a separate repository that we start fresh on.
I don't know that that's going to work.
Why it's a separate repository? That sounds like a bad idea.
Sorry, not separate. Well, yes, a separate repository. Just so you could start, you could have a
You
completely
can have a branch, right? You can have a branch called 2.0, and then you can make changes on that branch. Well, as far as I know, that's how people typically do like 2.0. They have a branch for 2.0 and making changes on that branch while still maintaining 1.0 back like 1.0 features.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's fine, but basically a completely different GitHub endpoint. So by creating a branch, you're doing effectively that. Yeah,
the downside for that is like, for example, I'm a downstream project, depends on CSI. I have to check out two versions, 1.0 and 2.0, and do build for like, I'd rather try to avoid like check out to the same repo twice. I'd rather prefer like we have two versions both inside the same repo. One, like for example, one directory for V1 API, one directory for V2 API.
What does that buy you?
Well, I don't have to check out twice.
I mean,
so for example, like in Go, if you wanted to have like one GitHub repo and do your versions across different branches, but then you wanted to refer to multiple branches at the same time within one project, like that's difficult unless you've somehow incorporated everything into the namespace, right?
Yeah.
Another thing that you can do easily, cherry picking. Let's say if you want to do the change on V2 and V1, it will be much easier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Convenience.
Yeah. Assuming that there's any kind of backward compatibility between V2 and V1.
Yeah, of course.
Which that's not guaranteed, because the whole reason of cutting a V2 is so you can make incompatible changes, right?
Yep.
So as a storage vendor, I want to write one plugin that works with multiple COs, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to have to go back and write a V2 because Mesos only goes to V2 and Kubernetes goes to V3, and I don't want, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to have to maintain different branches of stuff just because different cloud providers only support different versions.
And that's fine. As long as you're able to import different flavors of the library, you can expose multiple versions on a single endpoint. Whether all of this machinery needs to be built in with additional build tools and all this is, I guess, the question. Or can we just rely on the existing branching logic that already exists in GitHub and then just branch accordingly when we go to V2?
I don't think branching is going to be sufficient.
Yeah, no, I don't either. But what are we losing by having a V1 packet, like by namespacing it in V1? Like, it seems like we're only gaining the extra namespace for future proofing. But I don't feel like we're losing.
By having an explicit directory in head for V1, or?
Yeah. So the Proto's our namespace.
I think the challenge there is going to be managing these two versions. So for example, if we start working on V2 and we want to make a bug fix on the V1 side, all the traditional cherry pick semantics and all this kind of stuff gets very blurry.
Well, I think like at which point we should have like a V1 protobuf and a V2 protobuf. And they can start to deviate if we did change semantics or like make backwards incompatible changes.
Yeah, likewise, a spec v1.md or spec v2.md.
Right. That's why I expect. I prefer them to be in the same repo. I think like this like one source of truth rather than two. and also like making cherry picking much easier if we want to do any change that's common.
And then we can.
I think that's fine.
Not to do that in the future. Like we could just go ahead and namespace and be like, you know what, we don't really want to keep this here. Let's do it somewhere else, and it'll still just work. But we can't go the other way around. We can't say, oh, I wish we did this as a namespace package, and now we can't. So we have to go do it in another repo or whatever.
Yeah.
I think we have 15 minutes left. Let's get a closure on this. Like, I think the key question here right now is, should we eliminate that function or that RPC call or not? I don't think we have a conclusion yet. Well, I think my perspective on this is like, it's a little weird to me that we eliminate that one and still have version in every single RPC call. And Julian, you mentioned that you can use capabilities. That's exactly the point, that if you have capabilities, why do you need to have version in every single call? I mean, it just looks weird to me that I haven't fully flushed out this yet, but it still kind of looks weird to me that you have version in every single RPC call, but you don't have a version negotiation.
Yeah, that's a good
protocol.
point.
No, so capabilities to me is like, do you support encryption? The versioning is like, what's the field ordering of the proto buff, right? It's
the field ordering of the proto buff shouldn't change. Between 1.0 and 1.x, it should not change.
And
It'll change between 1.0 and 2.0, and those will be two independent protos, so that's fine.
Yeah, I think if the goal is trying to use capability and not use version to differentiate between features that we introduce along the way, then why have version at all? Like in every single RPC call. But if we decide not, this is like capability is not the way we want to go, still want to use version, then I suggest that we keep both, like get supported version and the version on every single RPC call, and use version to differentiate like features between versions.
I mean, capability and versions are pretty different, right? Because capabilities are these optional things, right? They're like opt-in. I want my plugin.
Well, you can use that for some other stuff, right? For example, like when you do a semantic change, you can introduce a new capability called like semantic change, whatever. Like I think like I've seen use cases for that. People use that for adding features. But that's one way. I'm not saying that's the way we should go, but that's one way.
I'm a little leery of like an explosion of capabilities as feature gates. But
could we say that we don't need the RPC right now, so we could take it out while we're breaking stuff and then add it in without breaking things later?
Yeah, that was my hope. That was my hope, is that we could just get rid of it now. And then make an additive non-breaking change later, especially if we have more clarity about, kind of a standard plugin.
But if we're going to do that, I think G's point is like, if you're going to do that, you should remove all versions, like even from every single RPC you currently pass in a version. That concept doesn't really make sense, so we should just remove all versioning altogether.
I think that's a fair point. I
agree with that too.
I think an alternative is just like keep that RPC call. I think like it's backwards compatible if you remove that in the future, right?
Right, but then you can't remove the version per RPC that we already have.
Right, I think that's because it's required. I think. Yeah. But that's like it's not like enforced by the wire protocol or something like this, because everything is optional in protobuf. We can reward the wording if we decide to get rid of that. We just say this one is optional. Well, that might break some of the plugins because they might just,
I mean, if we're going to do that, we should, anything that we want to remove, we should remove in this release. And if we think we can, we'll add it in the future. Additive changes are fine, but removing things will be hard. So if we think that we're not, so let's talk about the utility of having a version on every single RPC call. Right. If I'm to Julian's point and to Brad's point, if I want to make, I want to kind of not worry about which version I'm using. I want to just be able to say I'm issuing a call for create volume. I'm issuing it against a known endpoint, which is versioned, V1, V2, whatever. Then there's really no need to specify an internal version, subversion for the.
So create volume. So we talked about create volume and then also using that, overloading that for snapshots. So V1 create volume, we don't have any kind of
That's a
snapshot
terrible
function,
idea.
right? And so V2, we had something in there for like snapshot name. You know, we had some extra fields into it. We would, as a storage vendor, I may want to support both of those.
That
Right.
sounds
That's
like a
fine. So-
capability, right? I mean,
It can be a capability, and it's also
Well,
like
it's a capability, but they're two separate calls. One has a snapshot, you know, some extra parameters for snapshot, and the other one doesn't.
right, but that's okay. Like gRPC protobufs are backwards compatible in that way that you can add in additional fields without issue. You only can't remove fields. So additive changes are perfectly okay and supported just by gRPC and Proto. It's the removing fields which is incompatible. You can't do that within compatible versions anyway. So between 1.0 and 1.x, we're not going to be able to do that. And so I don't think there's actually utility to having a per RPC version. If we have package versioning V1, V2.
I agree with that. It sounds like James wants a little bit of time to think about it. So I don't know which seems reasonable, but I'm not sure if we're gonna come to a conclusion
In the next 10 minutes.
10 minutes on this. But I guess I agree that, yeah, we could also get rid of the versioning in all the RPCs. Another alternative would be to leave it in one RPC, like get plugin info.
Could we just remove it and then file an issue for 0.3? We need to address this.
Yeah.
Problem is if we don't remove it now, then removing it in 0.3 will break 0.2 to 0.3.
I mean, remove it now and then file an issue. Say, hey, this is the top part.
Oh yeah. I'd totally be on board with that.
So just so I'm clear, that the proposal is to remove get supported versions. We're going to, and then also remove version from the top of each request
Yes.
message, but keep the namespace protobufs or not keep the namespace protobuf?
No, keep the namespace protobuf because that replaces the version negotiation, sort of.
And keep the namespace protobufs. The only question that remains then is the major versus minor version thing.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I think we haven't sorted this out yet.
Yeah. And for that, my 2 cents are before 1.0, it would be very useful to have minor versioning. Post 1.0, it's not. So if we can have, have my cake and eat it too. Let's until 1.0, let's do minor and then switch over to major after 1.0.
I think another thing we can do is just use number and don't tie the number to actually the major version number. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like the Android API versioning, and don't tie that to the major version. Like it's perfectly okay that we say, hey, for 1.0, it's gonna be V4 API or V5 API. So that whenever we make any backwards,
that gets weird.
Well, yeah, I mean that's how Android does things, right?
It's all weird. The whole thing's weird.
Yeah, the alternative is difficult though because when we go to if we're actually successful in going to 0.3 and not making breaking changes, then ideally, we wouldn't cut a new namespace because we didn't make any breaking changes, but we're cutting a 0.3 just to make ourselves, to add a bunch of new features,
that
right?
That actually reinforces G's point then.
Yeah.
I think that's my point. Yeah, we should. So that allow us to cut a 0.3 without bumping the API version.
And then whenever we want to actually cut a release, we create a branch that's actually tagged with the official release version. Or we just tag it with a particular release version. and whatever is the highest version is the one that is supported by that version.
Yeah, that actually, yeah. If we do that, actually, like, get supported version will be useful. I mean, but the version is not the version that we have in the repo, like 1.0 or 0.3. It's gonna be the API version that the plugin support. If you have 100, like, or not 100, like 10, for example, Android has like 16 or 17 APIs. It would be nice to know like which subset this plugin supports, so that CO won't try like 17 API calls to find out like, oh, you only support like this particular version. Anyway, I don't think we should do that right now. It's for a long time. But I think like decouple the API version from the release version of the spec itself sounds reasonable to me. I think that's what like CNI was doing, but they did that in a different way. I think their like API version is like 0.2, 0.3, but the CNI release, like CNI repo version is like 0.7, which is like in a weird state. So I would rather like make these two very separate things. And then make it very clear these are separate things.
I think making it very clear that they're separate things is going to be hard if you haven't been well versed in it. Somebody tells you CSI v7, you're going to be like, what?
Yeah, but that's
there's
API
confusion
version
there.
Yeah, but I think the CNI way is also confusing.
Yeah.
I think either we go consistent, like spec 1.0 release is API 1.0. It's API v1, or we go with the other way. I mean, there's no middle ground, and the middle ground will be very confusing to people. I think CNI did a poor job on that, and I think we should avoid doing that.
I would prefer to just have a single version. Whatever we have internally is what we expose, and that just minimizes the confusion. But I do realize that doing that makes our job much more difficult.
Especially we don't address the minor version breaking change. I think that the concrete problem we're trying to solve here is if we make another breaking change and we need to bump the version, what that version should be.
We could still do minor version and then switch over to major after. So we could do 0, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4. And then as soon as 1 hits, that becomes 1. And then the next version is 2, and then so on and so forth.
Yeah, really, this is just all about us doing some weird stuff because we're not at 1.0 yet. So, I mean, I think we just got to get to 1.0 faster. And if we say, hey, you know what, we're still kind of young and unstable, so that means that there's a higher likelihood that we have a 2.0, then fine. At least we're not inventing a bunch of weird shit to like layer semantic versioning onto API, incremental versioning, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
So the reality is, like, we're not going to have a whole lot of breaking changes on every single function call for every single release. But if we have to rev the version for every RPC call on every release, you're going to end up with, 100 crate volume that you have to support. But maybe the crate volume doesn't actually change.
All of this stuff is an anti-goal, right? Like, I mean, V2 is an anti-goal for us,
That's a good
but
point.
we're just trying to buy insurance.
Yeah, I think you don't have to bump the API version if you're not making any backwards incompatible change. I mean, if all the changes you go into the next release is additive, then you don't have to bump the API version. It's just gonna be like CSI release, CSI repo release 0.3, API version still 1.
Then we also, we're already differentiating from 0.1 by having the new namespace.
Yes, I think 0.1 to 0.2 is definitely breaking, and there's no way to make a plugin support both. I expect most CO and plugin will switch to 0.2 very soon after 0.2 is out, because no way you can support both right now.
Well, I mean, they could with the new namespace. They could.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, that's good. So that means we have to do that namespace thing.
Yep. Then we just don't make breaking changes.
So we got 2 minutes left. I think
really
my fire alarm is scheduled to go off in 2 minutes, so I got to run.
Oh, fine.
Can we summarize the conclusion, and then let James think it over and decide afterwards? Proposal is 1, remove get versions altogether and remove the versions from the individual RPCs. 2 is to proceed with the plan that James already has to have versioned proto buffs or versioned generated bindings. And the three open question is whether what that should look like for pre 1.0, post 1.0. We can take that to the issue.
Yeah, I think like one strategy is just like go 1.0 after this, and don't do any breaking change in between. I think that will be
that
very
actually
compatible.
seems reasonable to me too, because that'll align with when we want to go GA.
Okay, that sounds good to me. That plan. I think James will think about that and get back to you guys.
Okay. Any other last comments? Julian, are you okay with this proposal?
Yep. However we decide it.
Okay. And Brian?
I just wanted to say thanks for the feedback. This is really helpful.
Cool. And thanks for getting this, working on this, James.
Sure.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.